Hey St. Paul, it's Pastor Clark. It's been a while since I've done a Bible study video. I'm excited to get back to it. This hybrid school, Monday mornings, I'm on with the kids, so that's kind of interruptive. If it doesn't get done on Monday, then it doesn't happen anyway. Now, a little space, a little freedom to get back to these worship videos that anticipate what we'll hear in worship on Sunday. This coming Sunday, we will be celebrating Reformation Sunday. And, usually it's John 8 is every year the gospel reading for Reformation. But I, for several years now, been in the habit of just going with the regular lectionary reading for the gospel and letting the themes of Reformation resonate with a different gospel reading. That John reading is the truth will set you free, right? Jesus says that. But this year for Reformation, we'll hear this little selection from Matthew 22. So let's jump in. Now, just to set some context. So for several weeks now, at least the last 4 weeks, I think, we've been following on from in Matthew from what happens after Jesus enters Jerusalem. Palm Sunday, the occupation of the temple, right? Chasing out the money changers, slipping over their tables, and Jesus begins to teach in the temple. And what we really pick up and what Matthew focuses on is the conflict of the religious leaders in various configurations, the chief priests and the scribes, and then it's the Pharisees and the Herodians, and then we skipped a week here. We skipped a gap in Matthew. It's the Sadducees, and now we're back to the Pharisees for this reading. But this is really the heart of the conflict in the gospel is Jesus with these religious authorities. And we can see the religious authorities being defenders of the status quo, defenders of the, social power dynamics, and using, their sense of religion is what leads them to that position. Jesus is on the side of changing that status quo, and that's why this conflict with the religious leaders is so critical. Jesus is arguing for a way of understanding Scripture and understanding the tradition as being one that favors the vulnerable, the widow and the orphan, so to speak. Matthew's Beatitudes names the people for whom Jesus is reading Scripture and for whom Jesus' ministry is centering. The poor in spirit, those who grieve, the peacemakers, those who hunger and thirst for justice, right? So this conflict is playing out now, not on the people's turf, which was when Jesus was in Galilee, but Jesus has brought Galilee to Jerusalem and to the very temple, and kind of escalated that conflict. He could have turned the heat down by keeping it quiet or staying in Galilee, but he came to Jerusalem. And we're coming now in kind of the tail end of this conflict, when the religious leaders will decide that they have they're not able to split Jesus's coalition by making him trip on his words. They're not able to trap him in any way, and so we're soon moving to the cross. But here's one of the last interchanges between Jesus and his enemies. They're trying to trap Jesus here. So here we go. Okay. So when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, now Pharisees and Sadducees are not natural allies. In fact, they were at odds with each other until they had a common enemy in Jesus. Jesus and the Pharisees are probably more closely related. They're more naturally connected, but it's the difference between whose side whose side are we on? Are we on the side of tradition and the Roman Empire, or Jesus on the side of the people and not the Roman Empire? So here we go. These folks are now politics makes strange bedfellows. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees are on the same side. They gather together, and they being the Pharisees gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question to test him. Now, no question in that time, no question asked in public was a neutral question. No one is just asking a question out of curiosity if they're asking it in public. It's always a challenge to someone's honor, to someone's standing. It's an attack. And so here it is. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Now, everything that the Pharisees did, they pinned back to one verse or a couple of verses in Deuteronomy. That's kind of like the heart of what they're about. And so if Jesus says that, then they can claim victory. But it gets more complicated. The very verse that Jesus quotes first is the one that they hang everything that they do on. So Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." Now, this is from Deuteronomy. This is kind of a foundational, a hook that the Pharisees hang what they teach on and their priorities on, loving God. Jesus quotes it. He knows that this is where they're coming from. Jesus goes on to say, "This is the greatest and the first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The Pharisees don't add that verse, hold that in the same esteem, I guess you would say, or point to it as key and critical as love God. And so part of what Jesus is, okay, let me finish with this passage and then we'll go into that. So on these two commandments, Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor, hang all the law and the prophets. So part of what Jesus is doing here is, it's right in line with everything he's been doing before, which is talking about, like the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. He's basically putting these two together to say that they're actually not, it's not either or, it's both and. We talked about both and on Sunday. It's both and that actually these verses kind of go together. They interpret each other. What does it mean to love God? Well, it means to love neighbor. And how do you love God? You love your neighbor. So these verses fit together, says Jesus. And his kind of his central critique of the Pharisees and many other religious leaders is they're not loving their neighbor as, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. They're not doing that. They're not loving the neighbor as they love themselves, and instead are practicing a faith that they say is loving God, but that harms the neighbor or ignores the suffering or difficulty of the neighbor. So this is core to Jesus's disagreement with the Pharisees. He puts it very plainly. And I don't know. These days are conflict-filled days. We've got an election around the corner, and this sense of partisanship has been growing, and polarization just feels like we can't even agree. We don't even see the world in the same way to agree on what reality is. And I think we might, the temptation perhaps is to see that everything that happens in the Bible is somehow outside of the real world that we live in. That the real world that we live in is so far removed from any sense of a perfect and normal and loving place that's in the Bible. But that's just not the case. I mean, the gospel is a conflict from beginning to end. In Matthew, Jesus' birth triggers a reaction from King Herod to try to kill him. That's in the first, second chapter. So there's been a life or death struggle, a life or death conflict that's been going on this whole gospel long. And in stating what the heart of Jesus's ministry is and what he sees as the heart of the very tradition of good religion, is these two verses: love God, love your neighbor. And it's that loving God and loving neighbor that will we see it before and after this moment. It's in Jesus's ministry up until this point, and it's in the couple of days that follow. It's probably not a week out from this interchange with the Pharisees and Jesus's arrest, crucifixion, resurrection. That's what loving God and loving neighbor looks like for Jesus, is being willing to suffer in that way. First of all, is standing firm and holding fast in the face of these religious authorities, in holding on to love of the people, and pushing for advocating for a kind of religion, practice of faith that is very in tune with the neighbor. That's all about loving neighbor, rather than somehow loving God in this separate sphere that has no impact, where people are actually hurting and suffering. Jesus is willing to suffer for that, and in that way join the suffering of those who suffer. He doesn't want any religion that's divorced from a sense of reality. And it's that love that will raise Jesus from the dead. In raising Jesus from the dead, God says Jesus was right, vindicates him, and also opens a way for us. The way is the way of love. These two verses are paving the way for Jesus in a sense. Okay, so anyway, to kind of get back to the moment we're in, I was reminded of this book. Hopefully, The Universal Christ. We were reading this together and practicing contemplative prayer together in a couple of groups at St. Paul before the pandemic hit. So we missed a chance to finish this book together. But I want to read a couple of paragraphs from the appendix, where Father Richard Rohr kind of breaks down his sort of, I guess you could call it his worldview or what have you. But I think it really connects with this love God and love neighbor, and with the reality that we're in right now, like the real world that we're in. So, quoting, based on years of spiritual direction with people both in the United States and in other countries, I have observed that the implications of this journey are different for those who identify as either conservative or liberal. Conservatives must let go of their illusion that they can order and control the world through religion, money, war, or politics. This is often their real security system. Their intense religious language often shows itself to be a pretense and a cover for very conservative politics. True release of control to God will show itself as compassion and generosity and less boundary keeping. Liberals, however, must surrender their belief in permanent disorder and their horror of all leadership, eldering, or authority, and find what is good, healthy, and deeply true about a foundational order. This will normally be experienced as a move toward humility and real community, they must stop reacting against all authority and tradition and recognize these are necessary for continuity in a culture, along with basic mental health, which allows them to belong to something besides themselves. To move towards greater wholeness, both groups, each in a different way, must let go of their false innocence. Both liberals and conservatives are seeking separateness and superiority, just in different ways. I'll say that again. Both liberals and conservatives are seeking separateness and superiority, just in different ways. In my language, they both must somehow be wounded before they give up these foundational illusions. The recovery movement, like AA, for example, calls this step one, the admission of powerlessness. He goes on to say, I'm skipping a bit here, he says, we all come to wisdom at the major price of both our innocence and our control. Innocence and control. This to me resonates so much with how Jesus responds to the Pharisees, what love God and love neighbor mean in this time and place, and what I think it means both on a individual level and on a corporate level, on the level of our nation and on a level of each of us as people. And I think that to really love in the way that Jesus is inviting us to love, it includes this, this sense of wisdom that Richard Rohr talked about. So this is what he said. We all come to wisdom at the major price of both our innocence and control. And I might change that a little bit or play with this. See how this fits for you. We all come to love at the major price of both our innocence and our control. I mean, what does it mean to me to lose my innocence? Well, what I have to let go of is my sense that I'm better than at a basic level. My sense that I know best what love is. That I am spotless, perfect in love. Basically, I have to admit that I have something to learn about this love. There's no way to love well without, for me, to love well without recognizing that I've fallen short of love and do that constantly. Not just maybe like at one or two key moments in my life, but like every day. So that's what losing innocence to me means. And losing a sense of control. Too often what we call love is actually disguised as an attempt to control. It's possible that the Pharisees went into this encounter with Jesus believing that they were doing the loving thing. But what they were really trying to do was to control Jesus, to stop Jesus, to stop his movement, to hold on to the status quo, to prevent the invitation to growth that Jesus represented, was offering. Love is not control. Love is not controlling. Love is freedom. And I see the tendency to try to control myself, to control others. Oh my gosh, we're doing this online school stuff, and holy cow. I feel like this morning was a prime example of, Amos just hit a wall, and I was trying to get some things done while he was doing that, and all I wanted to do was for him to stop crying and do his work. And I think my response to him was more controlling than loving this morning. We can't come to love if we're hell-bent on being in control. The only way to come to love is to let go and that usually means a surrender to our sense of vulnerability, and a willingness to just be open-hearted in that way, allowing the possibility of being wounded, of being hurt, of letting someone else take the reins, yielding to someone else. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Sounds so simple. I think we all know, both on the national level and on an individual level, that this love requires a complete rewiring. There's no switch to flip. There's just a daily commitment, new every day, renewed every day, to practice a different kind of way of relating to our own selves as well as relating to our neighbor. And none of those possible without a right relationship, a relationship of gratitude and surrender to God. There's a lot of good psychology as well as good politics and good family therapy in these passages. So I hope that you can find a way to rest in God's love and the promise of the cross, that it was in this great love for us, for all the world, for all of our neighbors, great love for God, that Jesus did what Jesus did and stayed loving all the way to the end, even though it killed him, and showed us that love is more powerful than hate, than death, than conflict, and anything else. Thanks be to God.